Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something darker than you'd expect. A story about a woman who looked at marriage, the one thing every person in power told her she had to do, and said no for 45 years, and then turned that refusal into worship. If you're settling in from Tokyo at 3 a.m. or having lunch in Brooklyn right now, drop a comment. I always love seeing where you all are when these stories find you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull up a blanket, and let's talk about how Elizabeth I made her virginity more powerful than any crown. In 1558, a 25-year-old woman became Queen of England, illegitimate by her father's decree, Protestant in a Catholic world, female in a kingdom that believed women couldn't rule alone. Everyone expected her to marry. Immediately. It wasn't a suggestion, it was survival. But Elizabeth I did something no one saw coming. She refused, not just once, not quietly. For 45 years she refused every proposal, every alliance, every political marriage that would have secured her throne. And then she did something even more shocking. She turned that refusal into worship. She didn't just stay unmarried, she became the Virgin Queen, draped herself in white, covered her portraits in symbols stolen straight from Catholic altars, made her body, her unmarried, unconquered body, into a sacred object that no man could touch, not because she was pious, because she was brilliant. Tonight we're pulling apart how Elizabeth I transformed her virginity from a political liability into a cult, how she used pageants, portraits, and speeches to make herself untouchable, how she stole imagery from the Virgin Mary and weaponized it, how she turned married to England from a metaphor into a religion. This isn't a love story. This is a masterclass in propaganda. So settle in. This is going to take a while. Let's start with the absolute nightmare Elizabeth inherited. Because understanding why she stayed unmarried requires understanding what marriage meant in the 16th century. It wasn't romance, it wasn't partnership, it was transfer of property. When a woman married, everything she owned became her husband's. Her lands, her money, her body, her children, her legal identity essentially disappeared. She couldn't sign contracts, couldn't make wills, couldn't testify in court. She was covered by her husband, a legal term that meant she ceased to exist as an independent person. The legal doctrine was called coverture. The moment a woman spoke wedding vows, she was covered by her husband's legal identity. Her property? His, her income? His? Any children she bore? His, legally speaking. If she earned money, it belonged to him. If she inherited land, he controlled it. If someone owed her a debt, he collected it. A married woman couldn't sue in court without her husband's permission, couldn't be sued separately, couldn't sign legal documents. Her signature meant nothing. In the eyes of the law, husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. This wasn't ancient history. This was current law, enforced, accepted, considered natural and right. The legal scholar William Blackstone would later write that the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended. Like she was frozen, put on hold, waiting to become real again, only if her husband died first. Now imagine you're Elizabeth. You've just become Queen of England. You control armies, sign treaties, command a navy, execute traitors. You are the law. And every man in Europe is telling you that you need to hand all of that over to a husband, immediately. Because women couldn't rule alone. Everyone knew this. It was medical fact, biological reality. Women were too emotional, too weak, too influenced by their wombs, which apparently wandered around their bodies causing hysteria. The theory was real. Physicians genuinely believed that the uterus moved, that it could detach from its proper location and float upward, pressing against other organs, causing fainting spells, irrationality, melancholy, and madness. They called it suffocation of the mother being the womb. The cure, marriage, pregnancy, regular sexual intercourse to keep the womb weighted down and satisfied. An unmarried woman's womb was considered inherently unstable, dangerous, likely to wander. This wasn't fringe medicine, this was mainstream medical knowledge, taught in universities, written in textbooks, cited by the most respected physicians in Europe. So when Elizabeth's counsellors pressured her to marry, they weren't just being politically strategic. They genuinely believed her unmarried state made her medically unfit to rule, that her wandering womb could cause her to make irrational decisions, that pregnancy would stabilise her, ground her, make her mentally sound. Elizabeth knew all of this. She'd been educated by the best tutors in England. She'd studied medicine, philosophy, theology. She knew what men believed about female bodies, and she knew that the moment she married, every decision she made would be attributed to her husband. Every success would be his accomplishment. Every failure would be proof that women shouldn't rule. Elizabeth's own counsellors believed this. Her advisors, the men who were supposed to help her govern, they genuinely thought she was physically incapable of ruling without a man. So the pressure started immediately. Marry, produce an heir, secure the succession. Don't leave England vulnerable. Reasonable advice, honestly. Because Elizabeth's position was terrifying. Her father, Henry VIII, had torn England away from Rome to divorce his first wife and marry Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Then he'd had Anne executed, beheaded on charges of adultery, treason, and incest that were almost certainly fabricated. Elizabeth was 2 years old when her mother died, old enough to remember her, old enough to understand later that her father had killed her mother to make room for a new wife who might give him sons. And then Henry declared Elizabeth illegitimate, bastard, unfit to inherit, removed her from the line of succession. For years, Elizabeth lived in legal limbo. Technically royal, actually nothing. Her status changed depending on her father's mood and political needs. Sometimes she was a princess, sometimes she was the king's bastard daughter who shouldn't even be at court. She watched Henry marry 4 more times after Anne Boleyn, watched him execute another wife, Catherine Howard, when Elizabeth was 8 years old. 2 queens executed within 6 years, both on charges related to their sexuality, both discarded when they failed to serve Henry's purposes. Elizabeth learned early that being a woman close to power was lethal, that marriage to a king was a death sentence with extra steps. Her half-sister, Mary I, had just died. Mary, who'd been Catholic, who'd burned Protestants, nearly 300 of them over 5 years, who'd married Philip II of Spain and nearly dragged England into permanent alliance with Spanish power. Elizabeth watched that marriage destroy Mary, watched her sister fall desperately in love with Philip, watched him use her. Philip was 27 when he married Mary. She was 38, older, inexperienced, desperate for love and for Catholic restoration. Philip married her for political access to England. He wanted England's resources for his wars against France. He wanted England's navy. He wanted a staging ground for Spanish power in Northern Europe. He did not want Mary. The marriage was negotiated entirely by ambassadors and counsellors. Philip and Mary met for the first time 2 days before their wedding. Philip spoke no English, Mary spoke no Spanish. They communicated through translators. Mary fell in love anyway, or convinced herself she had. She believed she was pregnant twice. Both times she wasn't. Phantom pregnancies. Her body so desperate to please her husband, to produce the heir everyone demanded, that it mimicked pregnancy symptoms. Swollen belly, missed periods, nausea. She prepared nurseries, announced the pregnancies publicly, and then months passed. No baby came. Just the humiliation of admitting she'd been wrong, that her body had betrayed her. Philip left England after the first phantom pregnancy, spent most of their marriage in Spain or fighting wars in Europe. He returned only when he needed something from Mary: money, ships, military support, And Mary gave him everything, bankrupted England to fund Philip's wars. Let Spanish advisors dominate her council. Let her husband control her kingdom while she sat in palaces, writing him desperate love letters that he barely answered. Elizabeth watched all of this from the sidelines, watched Mary make herself small for a man who despised her, watched her sister become a footnote in Philip's story, watched her die alone in 1558, unmourned by her husband, hated by half her subjects, having accomplished nothing but death and debt. That was the model of queenship Elizabeth inherited. That was what marriage looked like for a ruling woman. Not partnership, not love, exploitation, erasure, political suicide. Elizabeth was Protestant, in a country half Catholic, with a Catholic queen waiting in Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had a better claim to the English throne by blood. Mary was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. Her claim was technically stronger than Elizabeth's because Elizabeth was still legally illegitimate. Parliament had restored her to the succession, but the stain of bastardy remained. Catholics refused to recognise her as legitimate. The Pope declared her a heretic, said anyone who killed her would be doing God's work. Mary, Queen of Scots, was legitimate, Catholic, already married to the heir to the French throne. She represented everything English Catholics wanted. A return to Rome, a proper queen, a woman whose birth wasn't tainted by her father's sins. And Mary wasn't shy about her claim. She quartered the English royal arms with her own, declared herself rightful Queen of England, made it clear she was waiting for Elizabeth to fail or die. Elizabeth needed allies, needed security, needed to prove she could govern. Marriage was the obvious answer, the only answer according to everyone around her. But here's what everyone missed. Marriage would solve Elizabeth's legitimacy problem, but it would also end her reign. The moment she married, her husband would become king. Not king consort, king, with power over her, power over England. She would sign documents as Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen. But her husband would make the actual decisions. He would command armies, negotiate treaties, control finances. She would be queen in name, wife in reality. This wasn't theoretical. This was English law. When a queen regnant married, her husband automatically gained regal power. He didn't need Parliament to grant it, didn't need coronation. The marriage itself transferred authority. Philip of Spain had been King of England during his marriage to Mary. Not king consort, king, equally titled, equally powerful. More powerful in practice, because everyone deferred to the man. When Mary died, Philip lost the English throne, but for 4 years he'd ruled, and everyone had treated Mary as subordinate to him, even though she was the hereditary monarch, even though he'd only gained power through marriage. Gender trumped blood. Husbands trumped wives, every time. She'd watched Mary sign documents as Philip and Mary, King and Queen of England, in that order, his name first, his title dominant. As if he was the real ruler and she was just the appendage, and Mary had accepted this, had insisted on it. Because that's what wives did. They submitted. They obeyed. They made their husbands the centre of power and convinced themselves it was love. Elizabeth learned from that, learned that marriage for a queen wasn't partnership. It was abdication. So when her counsellors started pressuring her to marry, she smiled, agreed it was important, said she was considering her options, and then did absolutely nothing. For months, then years, then decades, but she couldn't just refuse outright. That would look irrational, emotional, proof that women couldn't make sound political decisions. She needed a strategy, a way to stay unmarried without looking like she was refusing to do her duty. So she invented one, and it was spectacular. She would marry England, not metaphorically, not quietly, publicly, ceremonially, with all the ritual and symbolism of an actual wedding. She would transform her unmarried status from a problem into a political identity, from weakness into strength. She would become the Virgin Queen, and that virginity wouldn't be a lack. It would be a gift, a sacrifice, a sacred offering to her kingdom. She was going to turn her body into a religion, and England was going to worship at that altar. Elizabeth's coronation in January 1559 was the opening act, the first time she tested this strategy publicly. Coronations were always theatrical, processions through London, pageants at street corners, symbolic gestures. But Elizabeth's coronation was different, more deliberate, more carefully choreographed to send a specific message. She was crowned by a Protestant bishop, obviously, but the ceremony kept enough Catholic ritual to avoid alienating half her kingdom. Incense, elaborate vestments, the sacred oil of anointing. That anointing is important because it transformed her, literally, according to the theology of monarchy. The oil made her sacred, touched by God, no longer fully human, something between mortal and divine. The archbishop poured consecrated oil on her head, her breast, her hands, specific points that marked her as chosen, set apart, holy. This wasn't symbolic, this was sacramental. In medieval and early modern theology, anointing oil had real power. It changed the person it touched, made them capable of things ordinary humans couldn't do, made them representatives of God on earth. When you were anointed, you entered a liminal space, still flesh, but also something more, something divine. Kings had always claimed this, divine right, God's anointed. But for Elizabeth, it meant something extra, because she was a woman, and women weren't supposed to have direct connection to God. They needed male intermediaries, fathers, husbands, priests. Women couldn't be ordained, couldn't perform sacraments, couldn't speak with divine authority. The Bible itself said women should be silent in church, should learn in submission, should never teach or have authority over men. But Elizabeth was anointed, which meant God had chosen her directly. She didn't need a husband to mediate divine authority. She already had it. This became the foundation of everything that followed. Every time someone questioned her right to rule, she could point to the anointing. God chose me, not Parliament, not my councillors, not my father's will. God. And if you question me, you're questioning God. It was brilliant theology, impossible to argue against without committing heresy, and Elizabeth used it ruthlessly. During the coronation procession, Elizabeth did something clever. She stopped constantly, stepped out of her litter, spoke directly to the crowds, accepted flowers from children, let people touch her hands. This wasn't normal. Monarchs were supposed to be remote, untouchable. The entire point of monarchy was distance. You were above the people, set apart, too sacred to be approached casually. But Elizabeth made herself accessible, available. She wanted people to feel like she belonged to them, like she was their queen in a personal, intimate way. She'd take flowers from children and hold them up so everyone could see. She'd smile at old women in the crowd, and they'd burst into tears. She'd pause at pageant displays and listen carefully, nodding, responding, making eye contact with the performers. It was stagecraft, but it was brilliant stagecraft, because it made people feel seen, made them feel like Elizabeth cared about them specifically, personally, and it established a pattern. Elizabeth as the people's queen. Not distant and cold like Mary had been, not foreign and aloof like Philip, English, present. One of them, except also sacred, also anointed, also chosen by God. She was threading an impossible needle, accessible but untouchable, human but divine, theirs but not theirs. One pageant during the procession showed her as Deborah, the biblical judge who'd ruled Israel, a woman leader chosen by God who defeated enemies and brought peace. The message was clear. Women could rule. God approved. History proved it. The pageant showed Deborah sitting in judgment, giving wise counsel, leading armies. All things women supposedly couldn't do. All things Elizabeth was about to do. Another pageant showed the Tudor Rose, the symbol uniting York and Lancaster after the Wars of the Roses. Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry VII, had ended decades of civil war by marrying Elizabeth of York. Their union created peace, brought together two warring houses, made England whole again after generations of bloodshed. The implication? Elizabeth herself was that union. She didn't need to marry to bring unity. She was unity. Her body, her unmarried body, represented the reconciliation of all England's conflicts. York and Lancaster, Catholic and Protestant, English and foreign, all merged in her, all held together by her virginity, which kept her from being claimed by any one faction. She belonged to everyone because she belonged to no one. But the most important moment came at the end, when Elizabeth, newly crowned, addressed her people. She didn't talk about marriage, didn't promise to produce heirs. Instead, she held up the coronation ring that had been placed on her finger during the ceremony, a heavy gold band, ornate, significant. "This," she said, "is my wedding ring. I am already married to England." The crowd went silent, processing, and then erupted, cheering, weeping, because what she'd just done was revolutionary. She'd reframed the entire question. Yes, she was married, just not to a man, to the kingdom itself. Her subjects were her spouse, her children, her family. The crown was her husband, the realm was her lover. She'd consummated this marriage through anointing, through coronation, through the sacred oil that made her one with England in a mystical union that no human marriage could replicate. This wasn't metaphor. This was literal political theology. She'd performed a wedding ceremony with her crown as the groom and her kingdom as the witness, and everyone watching accepted it. Because what could they say? That marriage to England wasn't real? That sounded like treason? That her commitment to her kingdom wasn't as sacred as commitment to a husband? That made them look like they didn't accept her divine anointing. Elizabeth had boxed them in perfectly. She'd taken the marriage question, the weapon her enemies planned to use against her, and turned it into a shield, a source of power. She was married. Therefore, marrying a human man would be adultery, betrayal, breaking her sacred vows. How could anyone ask her to commit such a sin? But a single ceremony wasn't enough. She needed to maintain this fiction, build on it, turn it into something permanent, make it visual, make it undeniable. So she started building the cult of the Virgin Queen, one portrait at a time. Elizabeth I understood something most monarchs didn't. Image was power. Not just representation of power, actual power. Control the image, control the narrative, control the narrative, control the kingdom. She'd learned this watching her father. Henry VIII had commissioned hundreds of portraits. Each one showed him larger than life, powerful, masculine, dominant, legs spread wide, shoulders broad, codpiece prominent. The portraits did political work. They made Henry look unchallengeable, made opposing him seem futile. The man in those paintings couldn't be defeated, couldn't be questioned, couldn't be anything but obeyed. Elizabeth took that lesson and refined it, made it more sophisticated, more subtle, more sacred. So she controlled her portraits obsessively. In 1563, she issued a draft proclamation forbidding any portraits of her to be made without official approval. The final version was never formally enacted, but the threat was enough. Artists knew. Paint the Queen wrong, and you'd never paint her again. You'd be ruined, blacklisted, possibly imprisoned. What did wrong mean? Anything that made her look old, sick, weak, human. Anything that suggested she aged like normal women. That time touched her, that her body was subject to decay. Elizabeth's official portraits don't show a woman. They show an icon, ageless, flawless, covered in symbols that transform her body into a sacred text. Let's start with the colour white. Elizabeth wore white constantly, in portraits. White gowns, white ruffs, white sleeves, pearls which were white, dripping from every surface, strands of pearls around her neck, her wrists, woven into her hair, embroidered onto her dresses, sometimes hundreds of pearls in a single portrait. In the 16th century, white meant purity, virginity, but more specifically, it meant the Virgin Mary. Catholic iconography had always shown Mary in white and blue, the ultimate pure woman, the mother who was somehow also virgin, the impossible female figure who reconciled sexuality and sanctity by eliminating sexuality entirely. Mary was the standard against which all women were measured, and every woman failed, because you couldn't be both mother and virgin, you couldn't be both sexual and pure. You had to choose, or so everyone thought. England was officially Protestant. They'd rejected the Catholic cult of Mary, torn down her statues, whitewashed her images from church walls, burned anyone who said prayers to her, destroyed shrines where pilgrims had venerated her for centuries. Protestants called Marian devotion idolatry, said Catholics worshipped Mary like a goddess, said prayers to Mary were blasphemy because only God deserved prayer. But here's what the Protestant reformers didn't understand. People loved Mary, especially women. She was the only female figure in Christianity with any power, the only woman who could intercede with God, who could work miracles, who cared about ordinary suffering. You prayed to Mary when you were sick, when your children were dying, when your husband beat you, when you were pregnant and terrified. Mary understood. Mary helped. Mary was the mother who actually cared. And then the Protestants took her away, destroyed her images, banned her feast days, said devotion to her was sin. They gave England's people a religion with no feminine divine, just God the Father, Christ the Son, the Holy Spirit. All male, all distant, all demanding obedience without offering comfort. But Elizabeth brought her back. Visually, she draped herself in Mary's colours. Let artists paint her with the same ethereal glow that had always surrounded the Virgin in religious art, made herself the replacement. This was calculated brilliance. England's Catholics missed Mary, mourned the loss of that female divine figure. The Protestants had given them a male God, a male Christ, male saints, and male clergy. No women, no softness, no maternal comfort. Elizabeth filled that void. She became England's virgin, their sacred mother, their pure protector who would never be compromised by a man's control. And because she was Protestant, this wasn't idolatry. This wasn't heresy. This was just respecting your queen, honouring her sacrifice, recognising her purity. Totally different from Catholic Marian devotion. Except it wasn't. Not really. It was the same psychology, the same need, just redirected to a different woman in white. Look at the Darnley portrait from around 1575. Elizabeth wears white, pearls everywhere. Her face is a perfect oval, skin like porcelain. No wrinkles even though she's in her 40s, no imperfections, no humanity. She's holding nothing, doing nothing, just existing as a perfect, untouchable object. Her eyes look directly at the viewer, calm, knowing, slightly superior, the gaze of someone who sees you but cannot be seen, cannot be known, cannot be possessed. Her dress in the painting is impossibly elaborate. Layer upon layer of white fabric, slashed sleeves showing white silk underneath, a white ruff so large and stiff it frames her face like a halo. Pearls sewn into every visible surface. This dress would have been unbearably heavy, would have taken hours to put on, would have required multiple servants just to arrange properly. You couldn't move freely in something like that. Couldn't bend, couldn't sit casually. You had to be still, perfect, controlled. That's the point. Elizabeth isn't dressed as a woman who does things. She's dressed as an object of veneration, a relic, a shrine that you approach with reverence and fear. The Pelican portrait from around 1574 is even more explicit. Elizabeth wears a pelican jewel on her chest, prominently displayed, impossible to miss. The pelican was a Christian symbol, a bird that supposedly pierced its own breast to feed its children with its blood when no other food was available. A symbol of self-sacrifice, of Christ's suffering, of love so great it destroys the lover. Medieval bestiaries claimed pelicans would stab themselves and let their blood drip into their children's mouths to save them from starvation. It wasn't true. Pelicans don't do this. But the image was powerful. The mother who gives everything, who destroys herself to save her children, who bleeds willingly, joyfully, because love requires sacrifice. Elizabeth was saying, "I am your pelican, I bleed for England. My virginity is the blood I shed, the sacrifice I make. I give you my body, not through children, but through service. Not through sex, but through suffering. Not through marriage, but through martyrdom. I could have married, could have had pleasure, could have had companionship, but I chose you instead. I chose to bleed for you, to pierce myself, to give you my blood." It's intense imagery, violent, visceral, and deeply Christian. Elizabeth was positioning herself not just as a secular ruler, but as a Christ figure, someone who sacrificed her body for the salvation of others, someone whose suffering redeemed the nation, someone whose voluntary celibacy was a form of crucifixion. Then there's the phoenix portrait. The phoenix, the bird that dies in flames and is reborn from its own ashes, eternal, immortal, self-regenerating. No need for a mate because it reproduces alone, creates itself from itself, lives forever through cycles of death and resurrection. Elizabeth was saying, "I don't need children. I am my own heir. I will rise from my own death. The monarchy doesn't require biological succession because I transcend biology. I am not subject to time, not subject to death, not subject to the normal rules that govern human bodies. I will rule forever. And when this body dies, I will return." Phoenix-like, eternal, insane propaganda. And it worked. Because people wanted to believe their queen was special, protected, chosen. Wanted to believe England was safe because Elizabeth couldn't die, wouldn't die, would always return. But the most famous is the Armada portrait from 1588, painted after England's navy defeated the Spanish Armada, Philip II's attempted invasion. This painting is pure propaganda, zero subtlety. Elizabeth sits enthroned in front of two windows. One shows the English fleet, triumphant, sailing in perfect formation. The other shows Spanish ships wrecked in storms, burning, sinking, destroyed by God's wrath. Her hand rests on a globe. Fingers splayed across the Americas, claiming, possessing, England's future as a global empire displayed casually under her palm. She wears white and gold, pearls everywhere. Her ruff is enormous, radiating around her head like a sun, like a halo, like divine light emanating from her body. Her sleeves are covered in bows, each bow tied perfectly, symmetrical, controlled. Bows were expensive. They required massive amounts of fabric, showed wealth. But more than that, bows needed to be tied. Someone had to tie them. Multiple someones. Dressing. Elizabeth required an army of servants, hours of work, and the bows, dozens of them, showed that she commanded this labour, that she was worth it, that preparing her body for public view was a collective ritual, a form of worship. She's not celebrating a military victory. She's demonstrating divine favour. God destroyed the Spanish fleet. God protected England. God worked through Elizabeth because she was holy, chosen, sacred. And why was she chosen? Because she was virgin, untainted, uncorrupted by male power or foreign influence. The Spanish Armada's defeat became the proof. Philip II was Catholic. He had the Pope's blessing. He claimed God was on his side. He was married. He had children. He had heirs. He represented everything the Catholic Church said was natural and right. And God destroyed him, sent storms, scattered his fleet, killed thousands of his men, left his ships wrecked on Irish beaches where locals stripped them for salvage. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, the bastard heretic virgin who refused to marry, won. Her tiny fleet defeated the greatest navy in Europe, not through superior numbers, through God's intervention, the Protestant God, who clearly preferred the virgin to the married king, who proved through weather and waves that Elizabeth's way was right. The message was unmistakable. Virginity equals divine favour. Marriage equals vulnerability. Elizabeth's refusal to marry hadn't weakened England. It had saved England. Because she was pure, untouched, holy, and God protects the holy. Every portrait reinforced this. Elizabeth as icon. Elizabeth as symbol. Elizabeth as something more than human. Something that couldn't be reduced to wife or mother or property. But portraits were static. They hung on walls, reached the nobility, the educated, the wealthy. Elizabeth needed something bigger, something public, something that would reach every subject in her kingdom and make them feel her virginity as a living, breathing presence. She needed spectacle, ritual, performance. November 17th. Every year from 1570 onward, this date was celebrated across England as Accession Day, the anniversary of Elizabeth's coronation, the day she became queen. But it wasn't just an anniversary, it was a religious holiday, a replacement for the Catholic feast days that had been banned. Church bells rang at dawn. Every church in every town and village, the sound carried across fields and rivers, waking people, reminding them. Today is special. Today is holy. Today we celebrate our Queen. Bonfires blazed. In London, massive bonfires in every ward. In the countryside, smaller fires on hilltops, visible for miles. People gathered around them, drank, sang, burned effigies of the Pope. Yes, really. They made straw dummies dressed as the Pope and threw them into the flames while crowds cheered. It was anti-Catholic, yes, but also pro-Elizabeth. Burn the Pope, celebrate the Queen. The two were inseparable. Prayers were said in churches thanking God for Elizabeth's reign. Special sermons praising her wisdom, her purity, her divine favour. Preachers compared her to Deborah, to Esther, to Judith, biblical women who'd saved their people. They called her the English Deborah, said God had raised her up to protect England from popish tyranny, that her reign was prophesied, that she was foretold. People wore her colours, white and green, white for virginity, green for youth, for renewal, for the Tudor dynasty. Women wore white ribbons in their hair, men wore green rosettes on their doublets. It marked you as loyal, as part of the celebration, as someone who loved the Queen. Pageants filled the streets, amateur productions in small towns, elaborate spectacles in London, all telling the same story. Elizabeth as saviour, Elizabeth as deliverer, Elizabeth as the Virgin who rescued England from darkness. The plots varied, but the theme was constant. England in danger, Catholics threatening, Spanish armies approaching, and then Elizabeth appears, white-clad, radiant, and through her mere presence, the danger dissolves. The enemies flee, peace returns. It was religious theatre, mystery plays for a Protestant age, the same emotional beats as medieval Catholic drama, the same use of spectacle and symbol to create communal religious experience, just directed at Elizabeth instead of saints. This was the Protestant Reformation's version of a Saint's Day, except instead of honouring a dead martyr, they were honouring a living queen, who was also virgin, also sacred, also capable of miracles. The central event was the Accession Day tilts, jousting tournaments held at Whitehall Palace. Not little affairs, massive productions, hundreds of participants, thousands of spectators, all of London's elite in attendance, foreign ambassadors watching, taking notes, reporting back to their kings about the insane cult the English had built around their queen. Knights would dress in elaborate costumes representing allegorical concepts: truth, love, desire, time, beauty, fortune, chastity. Each knight entering the tilt yard was a walking symbol. They'd spend fortunes on these costumes: velvet, silk, gold thread, jewels, feathers. Some costumes cost more than a manor house, more than a year's income for a nobleman. But it was worth it, because this was how you demonstrated loyalty, how you showed Elizabeth you loved her, how you competed for her favour. They'd ride into the tilt yard accompanied by musicians, drummers, trumpeters, singers. Each entry was a pageant, a little theatrical production. Some knights arrived in chariots pulled by servants dressed as mythological creatures. Others entered with elaborate props: fake mountains, miniature castles, trees with silver leaves, all symbolising something, all referencing Elizabeth. They'd present themselves to Elizabeth, who sat above it all on a raised platform, dressed in white and silver, covered in jewels, a living icon watching mortal men compete for her approval. Each knight would deliver a speech praising her, declaring his devotion, explaining his costume symbolism. These speeches got wild: declarations of undying love, promises of eternal service, statements that they lived only for her, that without her favour they might as well die. And then they'd fight, in her honour, for her approval, for her glance, not for her hand, for her approval, her favour, her glance. This was courtly love taken to religious extremes. The knights weren't trying to win Elizabeth, they were worshipping her, performing devotion, making their bodies, their blood, their bruises, their very real injuries into offerings at her altar. Jousting was violent. Men died, not often, but it happened. Lances shattered on impact, sending wooden shrapnel into faces. Knights fell from horses and broke necks. Helmets cracked, armour dented inward, crushing ribs. Blood soaked into the sand of the tilt yard. And through it all, Elizabeth watched. She sat on her platform like a goddess receiving sacrifice. Sometimes she'd react, gasp if a hit looked particularly brutal, clap if the technique was good, lower her handkerchief to favour a particular knight. That handkerchief became a sacred object. The knight who received it would keep it, treasure it, sleep with it under his pillow. Some had them sewn into special pockets inside their doublets, close to their hearts. Elizabeth's handkerchief, touched by her hand, scented with her perfume, worth more than gold. Elizabeth sat above it all, on a raised platform, dressed in white and silver, covered in jewels, watching, judging, occasionally lowering her handkerchief to favour a particular knight. She was the centre, the sun, the thing everything orbited around, unreachable, perfect, divine. The symbolism was everywhere. Knights would enter carrying shields painted with imprises, emblematic images with mottos: a heart pierced by arrows. Motto: I burn in service. A tree bearing fruit. Motto: from her all growth. A moon reflecting the sun. Motto: she is my light. A ship on stormy seas. Motto: she is my harbour. A phoenix in flames. Motto: from her I rise. Every image referenced Elizabeth. Every motto declared dependence on her. These weren't metaphors. These were theological statements. Elizabeth wasn't just their queen. She was their goddess, their source of meaning, their purpose for existence. Without her, they were nothing. Darkness, chaos, death. With her, they were illuminated, ordered, alive. And this wasn't subtle. The pageants explicitly compared her to Diana, the Roman virgin goddess of the hunt, chaste, powerful, surrounded by devoted followers who'd sworn off marriage to serve her. To Cynthia, the moon goddess, pulling tides, controlling cycles, governing the night. To Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice who'd left Earth during the Iron Age and would return only when a golden age began. Elizabeth was that return. The Golden Age personified. Proof that virginity wasn't absence but presence, wasn't lack but abundance, wasn't weakness but power. The tournaments went on for hours. Knights crashed into each other. Horses screamed, lances splintered, blood spattered across the sand. And through it all, Elizabeth sat motionless, watching men destroy themselves for a woman they would never have. Because that was the point, the impossibility, the eternal, unfulfilled desire. If Elizabeth married, she became attainable, real, human. Her mystique would collapse. She'd be someone's wife, someone's property, just another woman. But as the Virgin Queen, she was everyone's and no one's. Every man could imagine serving her, loving her, dying for her. But none could possess her. It turned political loyalty into religious devotion, obligation into worship, service into sacrifice, and the Accession Day celebrations made that worship public, communal, a shared ritual that reminded everyone, every year, that England was blessed, protected, chosen, because their queen was pure. By the 1580s, Accession Day was as important as Christmas. More important, maybe, because Christmas celebrated Christ's birth, but Accession Day celebrated England's salvation. The day Elizabeth became queen, the day England was delivered from Catholic tyranny, the day the Golden Age began. It was England's second chance, England's redemption, and it happened because of Elizabeth's body, her virgin body, her sacrificial body, her sacred body. But pageants and portraits weren't enough. Elizabeth needed to speak, needed to use her own voice to reinforce the mythology, to make people believe not just in the symbol, but in the woman performing it. So she gave speeches, and they were masterpieces. Elizabeth I was a brilliant orator, educated in classical rhetoric, fluent in Latin, French, Italian and Greek, trained in logic and argumentation. She'd studied Cicero, read Quintilian, knew every rhetorical device, every method of persuasion. She knew how to work a crowd. But more importantly, she understood that her speeches weren't just political statements. They were performances, rituals, sacred utterances from a divinely chosen monarch. When Elizabeth spoke publicly, it was an event. People travelled miles to hear her, stood in crowds for hours waiting. When she finally appeared and opened her mouth, silence fell. Total. Absolute. Everyone straining to catch her words. To hear the Virgin Queen speak. Because her words weren't just opinions. They were prophecy. They were truth. They were divine will made audible. And she used them to reinforce her virginity as political identity. The most famous is her speech to Parliament in 1559. Just months after her coronation, Parliament was already pressuring her to marry. They sent a delegation, made their case, asked her to choose a husband. They were polite but firm. The kingdom needs an heir. The succession must be secured. The Queen must marry. Elizabeth listened, stood silently while they spoke. Let them finish. Let them think they'd made a compelling argument. And then she stood and delivered a response that shut them down completely. She began by thanking them for their concern, for wanting her to marry, for worrying about the succession. She understood their anxiety. She really did. They loved England. They wanted England safe. They were doing their duty by asking her to do hers. Then she pivoted. And in the end, she said slowly, "This shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin." Silence. The lords looked at each other, processing. She wasn't talking about marriage. She was talking about her tombstone, her epitaph. What would be carved in marble after she died? Not a promise about the future, a statement about her legacy, how she would be remembered. She was telling Parliament, "I've already decided. My virginity is my monument, my gift to history. You're asking me to give up my immortality for political convenience. You're asking me to trade eternal fame for temporary security. And I'm telling you no, a marble stone, cold, permanent, eternal. While husbands die, while children die, while kingdoms rise and fall, the stone remains. And on that stone would be written the only truth that mattered. She was queen. She was virgin. She ruled well. She died pure. Then she went further. She held up her coronation ring. Again, the wedding ring she'd received when she'd married England. Held it high so everyone could see. Let the light catch the gold. Let them remember the coronation, the ceremony, the sacred vows. I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England. Not metaphor, statement of fact. She was already married. The question Parliament was asking, will you marry, was nonsensical, offensive even. She'd already made her vows, in front of God, in front of witnesses, with sacred oil sealing the union. How dare they ask her to commit adultery, to betray her husband, to break her marriage vows? Did they not see the ring? Did they not remember the coronation? Were they suggesting her marriage to England wasn't real, wasn't binding, wasn't sacred? Parliament had no response. What could they say? That marriage to England wasn't real. That would be treasonous, suggesting the coronation ceremony was invalid, that her anointing didn't count, that God hadn't actually chosen her. That sounded like rebellion, that she needed a human husband. That made them look like they didn't accept her divine anointing, like they didn't believe God had given her authority, like they were questioning divine will. Also treasonous, also heretical. Elizabeth had boxed them in, perfectly. Every argument they could make sounded like treason or heresy or both. So they bowed, thanked her, left, and didn't bring it up again for years. But the most famous speech came much later, in 1588, right before the Spanish Armada arrived. Philip II of Spain had assembled the largest invasion fleet in history. 130 ships, 30,000 men, 2,000 cannons, armed with the Pope's blessing and the explicit mission to depose Elizabeth, execute her as a heretic, and restore Catholic rule. England's navy was smaller, less experienced, outgunned. Fear was spreading. Some nobles were quietly preparing to flee, moving valuables, securing safe houses in the countryside. Others were negotiating potential surrenders, sending secret letters to Spanish agents, offering to switch sides if Spain won. Treason, but rational treason. England couldn't win. Everyone knew it. Better to survive on the winning side than die with Elizabeth. Elizabeth went to Tilbury, where her army was camped. 20,000 men waiting to defend England from Spanish troops if they landed. Waiting to fight, waiting to die. Because even if the navy won, even if they defeated the Armada, some Spanish soldiers would make it ashore. And then it would be hand to hand, brutal, bloody. Most of these men knew they wouldn't survive. Elizabeth rode out on horseback. Not in a litter, not carried, riding, dressed in white with a silver breastplate strapped over her gown. Ceremonial armour wouldn't stop a sword, wouldn't protect her, but it looked incredible. Like a warrior queen from legend, a Valkyrie, an angel of war, a sword at her side, a plumed helmet carried by, a page behind her. She rode through the camp slowly. Let the soldiers see her. Let them reach out and touch her horse. Let them hear her voice as she called out greetings, thanked them, blessed them. And then she rode to a raised platform where the officers waited, dismounted, stood before thousands of soldiers, and gave a speech that would echo for centuries. My loving people, I have been persuaded by some that are careful of my safety to take heed how I commit myself to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. She paused. Let that sink in. Her advisors had told her not to come, said the soldiers might kill her, might be Spanish agents, might be assassins waiting for a chance. She'd ignored them. Come anyway, because she trusted her people, loved her people, would die with her people if necessary. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. Let tyrants fear, not her. She wasn't a tyrant. She was beloved. Her people would never hurt her. Only tyrants had to fear their own subjects. Only rulers who oppressed and exploited and terrorized had to hide behind guards and walls. But Elizabeth, she could ride into an army camp unarmed because she knew she was loved. Then came the famous line, the one everyone remembers. I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Brilliant! She acknowledged the anxiety about her gender, admitted that yes, her body was female, weak, vulnerable, everyone could see it. She wasn't trying to pretend otherwise, wasn't claiming to be physically strong, wasn't denying biological reality. Her body was a woman's body, subject to all the weakness that implied, and then she transcended it. She had a king's heart, a king's courage, a king's stomach, meaning strength, resolve, capacity to fight. Her body didn't matter because her spirit was royal, divine, masculine in the ways that mattered for war. She could lead armies because leadership came from the soul, not the flesh, from courage, not muscle, from divine favour, not biology. She continued, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. She wasn't asking men to fight for her while she hid in a palace. She was joining them, leading them, becoming general, judge and rewarder, roles traditionally male, traditionally military. She would command them. She would judge their performance. She would reward their bravery. She was taking on every masculine role war required. And then the final line, the one that made it religious. I think foul scorn that any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. Foul scorn, not fear, not anxiety, scorn, moral outrage. How dare Philip challenge her? How dare he think he could conquer England when England had God's favour? When England's queen was chosen, sacred, pure, the sheer arrogance of thinking Spanish ships could defeat English shores when Elizabeth ruled. When the Virgin Queen protected her people with divine authority, she was saying, God is on our side, I am God's chosen, and Spain is about to learn what happens when you challenge divine will. Elizabeth wasn't just a military commander giving a pep talk. She was a prophet declaring divine protection, a priestess invoking God's wrath on invaders. And the soldiers believed her, believed that their Virgin Queen had special protection, that God wouldn't let Spain win because doing so would defile something sacred. When the Armada was destroyed, partially by English fireships, mostly by storms that scattered the Spanish fleet, everyone called it a miracle. God had intervened, sent winds to protect Elizabeth, just like he'd sent plagues against Egypt to protect Moses, just like he'd parted the Red Sea to save the Israelites. God protected his chosen people, and Elizabeth was chosen. Therefore England was chosen. Therefore the storms were divine. Why? Because she was virgin, uncorrupted, holy. The propaganda wrote itself. Philip was married, had children, had heirs, represented normal, natural monarchy, and God destroyed him. Elizabeth was unmarried, virgin, unnatural by every standard of the time, and God saved her. The message was unmistakable. God preferred the virgin, chose the virgin, protected the virgin, and England believed it, not just believed it, built an entire national identity around it. England was blessed because their queen was pure. England won battles because their queen sacrificed her body. England would rule the world because their queen was married to England alone. But speeches and festivals and portraits were all public, external. What Elizabeth really needed was private devotion, personal worship from the men who had daily access to her. She needed her courtiers to believe, not just perform belief, actually internalize the cult. So she created rituals, intimate ones, that turned proximity to her body into religious experience. Elizabeth's court wasn't just a government, it was a temple, and the courtiers were her priests, Access to Elizabeth was strictly controlled, ritualized. You couldn't just walk into her presence. You needed permission, invitation, approval from her ladies-in-waiting who guarded her like vestals guarding a sacred flame. Approval from her chamberlain who decided who was pure enough to enter the inner sanctum. When you finally entered, you bowed deeply. Some courtiers knelt, not out of respect, out of worship. This wasn't protocol, this was devotion. You approached Elizabeth the way Catholics approach the altar, the way priests approach the Eucharist, with fear and trembling and the certainty that you were in the presence of something holy. Elizabeth's private apartments were shrines, every wall covered with portraits of herself, miniatures in jeweled frames, medals showing her profile, tapestries showing her as Diana, as Astria, as Cynthia. Everywhere you looked, you saw her, multiplied, eternal, watching, like a Byzantine church covered in icons of Christ. Everywhere you turn, the Saviour's eyes follow you. In Elizabeth's rooms, everywhere you turn, the Queen's eyes follow you, judging, assessing, seeing into your soul. Her ladies-in-waiting dressed in coordinated colours, white and silver mostly. They moved around her like attendants around an altar, silent, efficient, reverent. They carried her gloves, her handkerchiefs, her fan, objects that had touched her body and therefore carried traces of her sacred presence. They handled these objects with visible care, didn't drop them, didn't crumple them, treated them like relics. Because that's what they were, relics. Courtiers competed for these objects. A glove Elizabeth had worn became a holy object. Men tucked them into doublets next to their hearts, kissed them in private, kept them in special boxes in their bedrooms, slept with them under pillows. Some courtiers requested specific items in their wills. I leave to my son the handkerchief Her Majesty gave me in 1585, passed down through generations like saints' bones. This wasn't romantic, this was devotional, the same way Catholics had venerated saints' relics. Fragments of bone, scraps of clothing, vials of blood. Elizabeth's courtiers venerated anything she'd touched. The theology was the same. Contact with the holy makes an object holy. Elizabeth's body was sacred. Therefore, anything that touched her body absorbed that sanctity, became charged with her presence, became a channel through which her power could flow, and Elizabeth encouraged it. She knew that personal devotion was more powerful than political loyalty. A man who worshipped you wouldn't just obey, he'd die for you, willingly, joyfully. He'd see death in your service as martyrdom, as the highest honour, as the completion of his purpose. She needed that level of devotion, because loyalty could be bought, could be threatened, could shift when circumstances changed. But worship? Worship was permanent. Worship couldn't be undone by political calculation or better offers. Worship was absolute. The most extreme example was Sir Walter Raleigh, explorer, soldier, poet, adventurer, and completely, utterly obsessed with Elizabeth. He wrote poems comparing her to the sun, to Diana, to Cynthia, not just comparing, equating, saying she was these things, not metaphorically, literally. Elizabeth was the sun. Elizabeth was the moon. Elizabeth was the virgin goddess who controlled tides and seasons and the entire natural world. He called her Gloriana, a name that caught on, used it in poems, in letters, in casual conversation. Other courtiers picked it up, started using it. Gloriana. It meant glorious but also divine, worthy of glory, which in Christian theology was reserved for God alone. Scripture said glory belongs to God. Humans don't have glory. They reflect God's glory if they're righteous, but they don't possess it, except Elizabeth did. Gloriana. She possessed glory, radiated it, was made of it. Raleigh's poem The Ocean to Cynthia is 22 stanzas of barely coherent worship, over 500 lines. Most of it doesn't make logical sense. It's emotional, mystical, the language of religious ecstasy. He describes himself as dust, as nothing, as shadow, as a man whose entire existence depends on her light. She is gone, she is lost, she is found, she is ever fair. Elizabeth is everywhere and nowhere, present and absent, real and mythical. Rayleigh can't possess her, can't even fully comprehend her, but he exists only in relation to her. Without her, he's darkness, chaos, void. With her, he's illuminated, given form, given purpose. This isn't love poetry, this is prayer. At one point he describes Elizabeth as the idea remaining of those golden ages, the Platonic ideal, the perfect form of which all earthly queens are imperfect copies. Elizabeth doesn't just rule well, she embodies the concept of perfect rule. She is queenship itself, the standard against which all other queens, past, present, future, are measured and found wanting. This was the emotional reality Elizabeth cultivated throughout her court. She needed men to feel that their worth came from her, that serving her wasn't obligation but privilege, that dying for her wasn't sacrifice but fulfillment, that they existed to orbit her like planets around the sun, drawing life from her light, meaningless without her presence. And it worked. Men bankrupted themselves trying to impress her. Robert Dudley built Kenilworth Castle, spent over £60,000, a fortune that would be millions today, hoping Elizabeth would visit. She did, for 19 days. He threw the most extravagant entertainment ever seen in England. Pageants every day, fireworks every night, musicians, dancers, a water pageant with a mechanical dolphin. Elizabeth smiled, thanked him, left, never came back. Dudley died in debt, still hoping she'd visit again. Sir Christopher Hatton built Holdenby House, the largest private residence in Elizabethan England, bigger than most royal palaces, built specifically for Elizabeth. She visited once, for a few days. Hatton never married, never lived in most of the house, kept it ready for her. For a second visit that never came. He died still waiting, spent fortunes on accession day tournaments, commissioned armour that cost more than estates, had it decorated with her initials, with symbols of virginity, with imagery connecting them to her. One knight's armour was covered in pearls, thousands of them, sewn individually onto leather. The armour was unwearable after one tournament, ruined by sweat and impact. £40,000 for a single day of demonstrating devotion, wrote sonnets, hundreds of them, composed music, songs about her beauty, her wisdom, her divine nature, fought duels over who loved her more, actually fought, with swords, drew blood, risked death over an argument about who was more devoted to the Queen. Elizabeth would hear about these duels and smile, wouldn't punish them, wouldn't tell them to stop, because their willingness to die over her proved the system worked. Elizabeth never reciprocated, never indicated that any of them had a chance. She accepted their devotion as her due, as simply the appropriate response to her presence. She let them worship, let them compete, let them destroy themselves trying to get closer to her. And she remained untouchable, unmoved, perfect. Because that was the system. The closer you got, the more you wanted. The more you wanted, the more you suffered. The more you suffered, the more devoted you became. It was a religious cycle. Desire, denial, devotion, repeat. The same psychology as monastic mysticism. Saints who spent lifetimes seeking union with God, who tortured themselves, starved themselves, isolated themselves, all trying to get closer to an entity that could never be possessed. That existed in eternal distance, and that distance was the source of power. God's transcendence made him worthy of worship. Elizabeth's unavailability made her worthy of obsession, and underneath it all was her virginity, the central mystery, the thing that made her untouchable, the reason no man could ever truly reach her. She was married to England, and England was a jealous spouse. Any man who tried to claim her was committing treason against the crown, against the nation, against the sacred bond Elizabeth had made visible through ritual and symbol and endless repetition. Her virginity wasn't a lack, it was a fortress, a boundary no one could cross without destroying the entire edifice of power she'd built. And everyone understood this, consciously or not. Approaching Elizabeth sexually wasn't romance, it was sacrilege. It was trying to defile a saint, to rape a goddess. Unthinkable, impossible. The thing that made worship possible was precisely the thing that made possession impossible. So they worshipped, and she remained virgin, and England called it golden. Here's what's wild. Elizabeth didn't just refuse marriage once. She spent 45 years negotiating marriage proposals, entertaining suitors, letting men believe they had a chance, and then, at the last possible moment, walking away. It was the longest con in political history, a game of diplomatic chess played across decades, with kingdoms as pieces and her body as the prize that could never be won. The proposals started immediately, within weeks of her coronation. Philip II of Spain, who'd been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, proposed, sent ambassadors, made his case. He was already a king, already proven, already wealthy beyond measure. He could protect England, could give Elizabeth the Spanish alliance that would make her untouchable. All she had to do was convert to Catholicism, submit to Rome, accept Spanish control. Elizabeth smiled, said she'd think about it, sent polite letters back with the ambassadors, thanked Philip for his interest, never said yes, never said no, just let him dangle. Kept him hoping while she figured out what she actually wanted to do. Used his proposal as leverage against France, let the French know Spain wanted England. Watched France suddenly become more generous, more willing to negotiate, more eager to keep England neutral. Then there was Eric XIV of Sweden, young, handsome, Lutheran, so religiously acceptable, desperately eager to marry Elizabeth. He sent proposal after proposal, sent ambassadors loaded with gifts, furs, amber, Nordic horses, a ship full of expensive presents meant to dazzle her. Elizabeth accepted the gifts, thanked him graciously, sent polite letters, never said yes, never said no. Just let him keep trying, keep hoping, keep sending ambassadors and gifts and increasingly desperate messages. Eric proposed for 7 years. 7 years. Finally gave up in 1565 and married someone else. Went mad a few years later, killed several nobles with his own hands during a paranoid episode, was deposed by his brothers and died in prison, possibly poisoned. Whether Elizabeth's rejection contributed to his madness, we'll never know. But the man spent 7 years obsessed with marrying her. 7 years of hope and rejection and diplomatic humiliation. Archduke Charles of Austria was next, Holy Roman Emperor's son. Catholic but willing to make concessions. Negotiations dragged on for years. Elizabeth requested portraits, multiple portraits, from different angles, wanted to see what he actually looked like. The portraits arrived. She studied them, asked questions. What was his temperament? His education? His religious practices? Would he attend Protestant services if they married? Could he practice Catholicism privately while supporting Protestant policy publicly? Sent ambassadors to assess him. They came back with reports. Charles was agreeable, willing to compromise, genuinely interested in the marriage. Elizabeth seemed convinced, told her counsellors she was seriously considering it. Let negotiations progress. Years of back and forth. Treaties drafted, terms negotiated, dowry discussed. Everyone thought it was happening. And then Elizabeth decided his Catholicism was a problem. Said she couldn't marry a man who wouldn't fully convert. Called it off. Charles was furious. His family was furious. Years wasted. Diplomatic capital spent. All for nothing. England's relationship with the Habsburgs chilled. But Elizabeth had gotten what she wanted. Years of Austrian goodwill. Years of Spain being nervous about an English-Austrian alliance, years of France trying to counteroffer, all without actually marrying anyone. This happened over and over. Different men, different kingdoms, same pattern. Elizabeth would express interest, let negotiations progress, extract diplomatic advantages, get England's enemies to treat her as a potential ally through marriage, get them to offer trade concessions, military support, favourable treaties, and then find a reason to decline. Too Catholic? Too Protestant? Too young? Too old? Too foreign? Too demanding? Always something. Always a reason that seemed reasonable but conveniently appeared after she'd gotten everything she wanted from the negotiation. Her counsellors were furious. They knew what she was doing. William Cecil, her chief advisor, wrote frustrated letters, begged her to actually commit to someone. Anyone. The kingdom needed an heir. The succession needed to be secured. She couldn't play games forever. Elizabeth would listen, nod, say she understood, promise to take the next proposal more seriously, and then do the exact same thing again. But they couldn't stop her, because publicly Elizabeth always seemed like she was trying, seemed like she wanted to marry, but circumstances kept preventing it. The suitor was wrong. The terms weren't right. The timing was bad. England wasn't ready. She was too busy dealing with a crisis, always something, and she performed disappointment so well. Would sigh, would say she'd hoped this one would work out, would seem genuinely sad that another negotiation had failed. So people believed her, believed she wanted to marry but just couldn't find the right match, believed circumstances conspired against her, believed she was making sacrifices, giving up personal happiness for England's good. Because admitting the truth, that she was manipulating them all, that she never intended to marry anyone, that the whole thing was theatre, would mean admitting they'd been fooled, that a woman had outsmarted them, that Elizabeth had played every major power in Europe like instruments in an orchestra she conducted. The most serious proposal, the one that actually scared her counsellors because it seemed like she might accept, was Francis, Duke of Alençon, younger brother to the King of France, Catholic but willing to convert. Not conventionally attractive, short, pockmarked from smallpox, nose that looked like it had been broken and reset poorly, but charming, witty, musical, good sense of humour. And he represented a French alliance that could protect England from Spain. Elizabeth was in her 40s, Francis was 22, half her age, young enough to be her son. The age gap was absurd, scandalous, everyone knew it, but the political logic was sound. France was powerful, Spain was threatening. An alliance through marriage would give England security, would let Elizabeth finally stop looking over her shoulder, would let her focus on domestic governance instead of foreign threats. Negotiations went on for years. Francis visited England twice, stayed for months. Elizabeth called him her frog, an affectionate nickname supposedly. Some historians think it was genuine affection. Others think it was calculated theatre. Elizabeth was brilliant at making men think they were special, think they had a chance, think she saw something unique in them. With Francis, she performed romantic interest. They exchanged love letters, public love letters that circulated at court, that were copied and read across Europe. Elizabeth wrote about how much she missed him, how she thought about him constantly, how she dreamed of their future together. She wore a ring he gave her, prominently, where everyone could see, touched it during council meetings, looked at it wistfully during public appearances. The message was clear. She loved him. She was considering marrying him. This might actually happen. Francis was ecstatic, wrote to his brother that the marriage was certain, started planning, started preparing to become King of England, and then, in 1581, after a decade of negotiation, after Francis had visited twice, after Elizabeth had worn his ring for months, she said no. The official reason? Her subjects wouldn't accept a French Catholic husband. There had been protests, pamphlets circulating, preachers denouncing the marriage. The people wouldn't tolerate it. Elizabeth had to listen to her people, had to respect their wishes. She was heartbroken, but duty came first, probably all true. There had been protests, but there were always protests about everything. Elizabeth could have ignored them if she'd wanted to marry, could have done what Henry VIII did when people protested his marriages, could have enforced her will through royal authority. She was queen. Her word was law. If she'd wanted to marry Francis, she would have, but she didn't. The real reason? She was never going to marry, not Francis, not anyone. But she'd extracted a decade of French diplomatic support, used the possibility of marriage to keep France friendly, used it to play Spain and France against each other, used it to demonstrate that she was desirable, that foreign princes wanted her, that England was valuable, that rejecting her was dangerous because she had options, got everything she wanted without giving up an ounce of power. It was ruthless, brilliant, and it only worked because of her virginity. If she'd married once, she couldn't play this game, couldn't dangle herself as a prize, couldn't use her body as a bargaining chip in every negotiation. Once you're married, you're off the market. You're unavailable. You can't leverage attraction and possibility and future alliance anymore. But as the Virgin Queen, she was always available, always potentially marriageable, always just out of reach but theoretically attainable. Foreign kings spent fortunes courting her, sent ambassadors, negotiated terms, offered dowries, offered military support, offered trade agreements, offered anything she wanted just for the possibility of marriage, and Elizabeth accepted their attention. Let them compete, let them exhaust themselves trying to win her, and never, ever said yes. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s. No one seriously believed she'd marry anymore. Couldn't have children, couldn't produce heirs, but the mythology had already solidified. She wasn't unmarried because she couldn't find a husband. She was unmarried because she'd chosen England, sacrificed her personal happiness for her kingdom's good, turned down princes and dukes and kings because she loved her subjects more, because England deserved her entire heart, because her vows to England were sacred, more sacred than marriage to any man could ever be. That was the story, the official narrative, repeated in sermons, in pamphlets, in ballads sung in taverns, and by the end of her reign, everyone believed it. Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, married to England, pure, untouchable, sacred, defined by what she hadn't done instead of what she had. But here's the question no one asks. Did Elizabeth actually want to stay unmarried? Or was it just the only way to keep power? Was her virginity a choice or a cage? Was she free or was she trapped by the mythology she created? Let's be honest about something. Elizabeth's virginity wasn't freedom. It was a cage she built herself. A cage made of symbols and speeches and portraits. A cage she couldn't escape, even if she wanted to, because escaping would destroy everything she'd built. She couldn't have relationships, not real ones, because every man who got close became a political liability. Every hint of romance became a scandal that threatened her carefully constructed image. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's childhood friend, possibly the love of her life, definitely the man she was closest to for decades. They'd known each other since childhood, been imprisoned together in the Tower during Mary's reign, both under suspicion of treason, both fearing execution. They'd survived together, bonded through shared trauma, understood each other in ways no one else did. Everyone assumed they were lovers. Rumours circulated constantly. Foreign ambassadors reported to their courts that Elizabeth and Dudley were secretly married, that she was pregnant, that they met in private and did God knows what, that her virginity was performance, that behind closed doors she was Dudley's mistress. Servants whispered, courtiers speculated, enemies used it as ammunition, called Elizabeth a whore, said she'd debased herself, said England was ruled by lust. Elizabeth couldn't marry him. The political calculus didn't work. Dudley was English nobility, not foreign royalty. Marrying him wouldn't create an alliance, wouldn't bring foreign support, wouldn't solve any of England's diplomatic problems. Worse, it would create domestic rivals. Dudley's family would become too powerful, would be one step away from the throne. His brothers, his cousins, all suddenly in line for power. It would start factional wars at court, between families trying to position themselves close to the Dudley clan, between families who hated the Dudleys and resented their rise. And there was the scandal about his first wife, Amy Robsart. She died in 1560, found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. Ruled accidental. But everyone suspected murder. Suspected Dudley had her killed so he could marry Elizabeth. Some suspected Elizabeth ordered it. The rumours destroyed any possibility of marriage. If Elizabeth married Dudley after his wife died under suspicious circumstances, it would look like they'd conspired to murder her. Would confirm every terrible thing anyone said about them. Would make Elizabeth look like an adulteress and a murderer. Would destroy her legitimacy completely. But she also couldn't let him go, so he stayed. Close, always close, never close enough. For decades, Dudley was the person Elizabeth trusted most. The person she turned to during crises. The person she wanted beside her during ceremonies and celebrations. She gave him titles, estates, positions of power, made him Master of the Horse, made him Earl of Leicester, made him one of the wealthiest men in England. But she couldn't make him her husband. When Dudley secretly married Lettice Knollys in 1578, Elizabeth was furious. Absolutely furious. Lettice was Elizabeth's cousin. Beautiful, fertile. Everything Elizabeth couldn't be, or at least couldn't admit to being. Dudley married her without asking Elizabeth's permission. Without telling her beforehand, just did it. And Elizabeth found out through gossip. She banned Lettice from court. For years, refused to see her, refused to speak to her, humiliated Dudley publicly, made him grovel, apologise, beg for forgiveness. Not because she wanted to marry him herself. If she'd wanted to marry Dudley, she could have done it decades earlier. But because his marriage to someone else broke the illusion, shattered the performance. For 20 years, Elizabeth had let people believe that Dudley was waiting for her, that he loved only her, that he was devoted solely to her, that their relationship was special, sacred, the romance that couldn't be consummated because of her duty to England. It was tragic, beautiful, the kind of love story people wrote ballads about, the Queen and her devoted servant, forever yearning, forever denied, forever pure. Dudley's marriage destroyed that narrative, proved he wasn't actually content with Elizabeth's distant affection, that he wanted a real relationship, a real wife, children, a normal life, and that made Elizabeth look foolish, made it obvious that whatever they had wasn't enough for him, that her virginity wasn't the romantic sacrifice she performed it as. It was just absence, lack, something he'd endured until he couldn't anymore. Dudley died in 1588, just weeks after the Armada. Elizabeth kept his last letter in a box beside her bed, labelled it his last letter in her own handwriting. She was 65. He'd been her closest companion for 40 years, and she'd never been able to fully have him, never been able to be normal with him, never been able to drop the performance and just be a woman in love with a man, because she wasn't just a woman, she was the Virgin Queen, and the Virgin Queen couldn't love, could be loved, could accept worship, could graciously receive devotion, but she couldn't love back, couldn't give herself, couldn't surrender to anything human and messy and real. That was the cost. And then there's the question of children. Elizabeth had no heirs, no direct descendants, no one to carry her blood forward, no one to continue the Tudor line. Henry VIII had broken with Rome to secure the succession, had married 6 times, had executed 2 wives, all trying to produce legitimate male heirs, and his daughter, the one he'd declared illegitimate, the one he'd almost executed, was ending the entire dynasty through her refusal to reproduce. This terrified her counsellors, because when Elizabeth died, the succession would be contested. Multiple claimants with equalish claims. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a claim. Her son James had a claim. Some distant cousins had claims. Without a clear heir, England would face potential civil war. Everything Elizabeth had built would collapse into chaos. Rival factions would support different claimants. Foreign powers would back different candidates. Blood would run in the streets while England tore itself apart. Elizabeth knew this. She wasn't stupid, wasn't naive. She watched her counsellors panic, watched them beg her to name an heir, to designate someone, to give England security, to let the kingdom prepare for the transition. But she refused, for decades, because naming an heir would make her vulnerable, would make her mortal. People would start looking to the future, stop fearing her, start courting whoever would be next. She'd seen this happen to her sister Mary. The moment Mary was sick, the moment people thought she might die, courtiers abandoned her. Rode to Hatfield where Elizabeth waited, pledged loyalty to Elizabeth, promised support, promised service, started treating Elizabeth like the Queen before Mary was even dead. Mary died alone, unmourned, replaced before her body was cold, forgotten before she was buried. Elizabeth wouldn't let that happen to herself, so she kept everyone guessing, kept the succession uncertain, kept multiple possibilities alive. That way, no one knew who to court. No one knew who would win. So they had to stay loyal to Elizabeth, had to keep her happy, because she was the only certain source of power. Everything else was speculation. She kept herself necessary through uncertainty, kept herself powerful through ambiguity. But it meant she died without descendants, without biological immortality. The Tudor line ended with her, Henry VIII's entire dynasty, all the bloodshed, all the wives, all the religious upheaval, all the death, all to secure the succession. And it ended with his daughter choosing virginity over continuity, choosing personal power over dynastic legacy. Was it worth it? Probably not to Elizabeth herself. Near the end, she must have thought about it, must have wondered what her life would have been if she'd married, if she'd had children, if she'd chosen normal human happiness instead of political power. Must have thought about Dudley, about the life they could have had, the children they might have raised, the quiet domestic moments they might have shared. All traded for a throne and a mythology and a name that would echo through history. But to the mythology, absolutely worth it, because her lack of heirs reinforced the virgin imagery. She hadn't just refused to marry, she'd refused to reproduce, had kept her body entirely separate from the messy, dangerous work of creating life, had preserved herself, kept herself intact, untouched, uncorrupted by the biological processes that defined and limited other women. She was like the Virgin Mary in that too, a woman whose power came from what she didn't do, didn't marry, didn't have sex, didn't give birth to mortal children. Mary gave birth to Christ, the Son of God. Elizabeth gave birth to something else, a nation, an identity, an empire. Married to England wasn't just propaganda, it was truth. She'd given everything to her kingdom, her body, her personal happiness, her chance at family, her genetic future, everything that made life human and normal and bearable, sacrificed on the altar of political power, and England worshipped her for it. But let's talk about what happened when she got old, because the Virgin Queen mythology required her to be ageless, eternal, perfect, frozen in time like the portraits, like the icon she'd made herself. And Elizabeth was human. Humans age, bodies decay, and that created a crisis. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s. Her teeth were black and rotting. The sugar she'd eaten, expensive imported sugar, a luxury only the wealthy could afford, had destroyed them. Dental care was primitive. No toothbrushes, no fluoride, no modern dentistry. Once teeth rotted, they stayed rotted. And Elizabeth's were falling apart. She had them pulled, the rotten ones, but not all of them. Some she kept because pulling them would change the shape of her face, would make her cheeks sink, would make her look old. So she lived with the pain, with the infections, with the constant bad taste in her mouth, with the humiliation of covering her mouth when she smiled so no one would see the black stumps. Her hair, once red gold and famous, was thin and grey, wispy, falling out in places. Whether from age or from the heavy lead makeup she wore, no one knows. Probably both. She wore wigs, elaborate ones, decorated with jewels and pearls and ridiculous height. Some were styled to add 6 inches to her height, made her look larger, more imposing, more goddess-like. Bright red wigs, fashioned to look like her hair had looked in her 20s. No one was fooled. Everyone knew they were wigs. But no one said anything, because saying it would be treason. Her face was caked in white lead makeup, ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, applied in thick layers. It gave her that porcelain perfection in portraits, made her skin look smooth, ageless, flawless. It also poisoned her slowly. Lead is toxic. It absorbed through her skin, built up in her organs, her brain, her bones. It ate into her skin, created sores, open wounds that wouldn't heal. She'd cover the sores with more ceruse, apply it thicker, try to hide the damage. But the sores got worse, infected, oozing. Her ladies-in-waiting would help her apply the makeup every morning, would try not to gag at the smell, would try not to stare at the wounds, would paint her face until she looked like the Virgin Queen again, until the dying woman underneath was hidden. Her face became a mask she couldn't remove, because underneath was worse, raw skin, scars, the visible proof of mortality. So she kept applying the lead, kept poisoning herself, kept maintaining the illusion. Because the Virgin Queen couldn't age, couldn't show weakness, couldn't let people see decay. She wore high collars to hide her neck that was wrinkled and saggy and covered in age spots. Wore heavy layers of fabric to hide her body that was thin and frail and bent. Wore gloves constantly to hide her hands that were gnarled with arthritis and spotted with age, covered every inch of skin that might betray her humanity. Elizabeth was dying, slowly, visibly, and it threatened everything. Because the Virgin Queen was supposed to be immortal, ageless, the phoenix that rose from its own ashes, the moon goddess who never changed, the eternal Diana who would rule forever. But the woman behind the costume was decaying, and everyone could see it. So Elizabeth doubled down. She banned any portraits that showed her aging, ordered existing portraits destroyed if they made her look too old. There's a reason almost all portraits of Elizabeth show her looking the same. Young, perfect, unchanging, because she destroyed the ones that didn't. The official images showed a woman in her 20s, smooth skin, perfect features. No hint of time's passage, no acknowledgement that 40 years had passed since her coronation. Meanwhile, the real Elizabeth was falling apart, but she still appeared in public, still performed the rituals, still sat through Accession Day tournaments and watched men fight for her favour, still smiled her black-tooth smile and waved her gloved hand and let people worship her. But it was grotesque now, an old woman in a young woman's costume, an elaborate lie held together by face paint and wigs and sheer force of will. Men knew, everyone knew. They could see the stiffness in her movements, could see her hands shaking, could hear her breath wheezing, could smell the rot, but no one could say it, because saying it was treason. The Virgin Queen didn't age, couldn't age. To suggest otherwise was to attack the foundation of her power, was to say the mythology was false, that the goddess was just a woman, that the icon was just flesh. Elizabeth became a living ghost, a relic of herself, still performing the role long after the role fit. Like an actress in her 70s playing Juliet. Everyone can see it's wrong. Everyone knows it's absurd. But everyone pretends because the alternative, acknowledging reality, would destroy the entire production. Her courtiers started preparing for the end. Quietly. Secretly. They had to. Because Elizabeth wouldn't. Refused to. Wouldn't name an heir. Wouldn't acknowledge that death was coming. Wouldn't make any provisions for England's future after her. So they did it behind her back. Started corresponding with James VI of Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots' son, who had the strongest claim. Started negotiating. Started making sure the transition would be smooth. Started betraying Elizabeth while she was still alive. Because they had no choice. Elizabeth's refusal to plan for succession was destroying England, creating chaos, creating uncertainty. Foreign powers were circling, wondering what would happen when the old queen finally died. Whether England would collapse, whether there would be civil war, whether they could invade during the chaos. Elizabeth knew her courtiers were preparing, knew they were corresponding with James, knew they were planning for her death, and she couldn't stop them, because stopping them would require acknowledging that she was dying, that the Virgin Queen was mortal after all, that the mythology was crumbling. So she pretended not to notice, pretended the letters didn't exist, pretended her courtiers were still loyal, pretended she would rule forever. She'd always known this day would come, but she'd refused to name James as her heir, refused to acknowledge that England would continue without her. Because in the mythology she'd built, England couldn't exist without her. She was England. Her body was the nation's body. Her virginity was England's purity. Her life was England's life. If she died, what happened to the nation she'd married? What happened to the mystical union? What happened to the cult? It couldn't survive her death. She knew it couldn't. The whole thing was built on her body, her presence, her performance. Once she was gone, it would collapse. James was married, had children, was normal. He couldn't be the Virgin King, couldn't replicate the mythology, couldn't make his body sacred the way hers was. So Elizabeth clung to power, clung to life, refused to let go, because letting go meant admitting failure, admitting that everything she'd built was temporary, that the cult of the Virgin Queen was just theatre, that she was just a woman who'd made herself untouchable and would die alone. In March 1603, Elizabeth fell seriously ill. Throat infection, fever. Her ladies-in-waiting begged her to go to bed, to lie down, to rest. She refused, stood for hours, leaning against furniture, holding herself upright through sheer stubbornness. When she couldn't stand anymore, she sat on cushions on the floor, wouldn't lie down, wouldn't go to bed, because lying down was surrendering, was admitting defeat, was becoming horizontal, passive, weak, everything the Virgin Queen couldn't be. As long as she was upright, she was still ruling, still in control, still the icon. But the moment she lay down, she became just a sick old woman waiting to die. Her counsellors begged her to name a successor. They'd been begging for years, but now it was urgent. Days left, maybe hours. The kingdom needed to know, needed to prepare. Who would be king? Elizabeth wouldn't answer, couldn't answer, because answering meant accepting death, meant giving England to someone else, meant breaking the marriage she'd performed at her coronation 44 years ago. Finally, barely able to speak, voice wrecked by the infection, she gestured. Some accounts say she said, "Who but our cousin of Scotland?" Others say she just moved her hand toward her head, indicating a crown, and her counsellors interpreted it as meaning James. We'll never know for sure. Maybe Elizabeth meant James, maybe she didn't. Maybe she just moved and they saw what they wanted to see, gave themselves permission to do what they'd already decided to do. Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603. She was 69 years old. She'd reigned for 44 years. Died virgin, died unmarried, died without heirs, died alone except for her ladies-in-waiting, who'd spent decades painting her face and arranging her wigs and pretending she wasn't aging. Her body was embalmed. The lead from her makeup made the embalming easier. Her tissues were already partially preserved by the poison she'd worn for decades. They dressed her in elaborate robes, white and gold, pearls, the Virgin Queen costume one last time, placed her body in a lead coffin, sealed it, carried it through London in a funeral procession that took hours. Thousands lined the streets, weeping, mourning. The Virgin Queen was gone. Some people genuinely loved her, remembered the victories, the stability, the fact that she'd kept England independent, kept them Protestant, kept them safe from Spain. Others just knew she was gone, and change was terrifying. 44 years of the same ruler. Most people alive had never known another monarch. She'd been queen longer than most people's entire lives. The procession carried her to Westminster Abbey, buried her next to her sister Mary. Ironic. Mary who'd been married. Mary who'd tried to restore Catholicism. Mary who'd burned Protestants. And Elizabeth who'd been virgin. Who'd been Protestant. Who'd executed Catholics. Together in death. The two sisters who'd represented opposite visions for England. Buried in the same tomb. As if none of it mattered. As if all the bloodshed and all the speeches and all the mythology amounted to this. Two bodies in a stone box, and with her death, the cult ended immediately. James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The Stuart dynasty began. A man, a married man, a man with children, normal, human, mortal. He couldn't replicate Elizabeth's mythology, didn't even try. He had a wife, Queen Anne. She was crowned beside him, shared power, had her own court, her own ladies, her own income, normal queenship, normal monarchy. The pageant stopped. The Accession Day tournaments ended. The portraits of Diana and Astria and Gloriana were put away, packed in storage, forgotten. The theology of virginity as divine power dissolved. England discovered it didn't need a virgin queen, didn't need mystical marriage between monarch and nation, didn't need sacred bodies and religious devotion. It just needed a king who could govern competently and produce heirs. James did both. England moved on. But the mythology didn't disappear, it transformed. Elizabeth became a legend. The Virgin Queen who'd saved England, who'd defeated Spain, who'd presided over a golden age of exploration, literature, and power, who'd ruled alone in an age when women weren't supposed to rule at all. She became what she'd always wanted to be, immortal, not through children, through story, through memory, through the sheer force of the mythology she'd created and performed for 44 years. So here's the question. Did it work? Did Elizabeth's transformation of her virginity into political power actually succeed? Or was it just an elaborate performance that collapsed the moment she died? Both, simultaneously. As a short-term strategy, it was brilliant. Elizabeth kept power for 44 years, died in her bed, maintained control until her final breath. Never had to surrender authority to her husband. Never had to watch a man take credit for her accomplishments. Never had to become legally erased through coverture. Never had to subordinate herself to anyone. She played Europe's most powerful kings, used marriage negotiations to extract diplomatic victories, kept England independent when it should have been absorbed by Spain or France, kept England Protestant when half of Europe wanted to force it back to Catholicism, defeated the Spanish Armada, established England as a naval power, funded exploration, supported Shakespeare and Marlowe and the entire Elizabethan literary renaissance, created the conditions for England to become a global empire. She transformed what should have been her greatest weakness, her gender, into her greatest strength, made people believe that her female body was actually an advantage, that her virginity gave her special power, special favour from God, made questioning her right to rule seem like heresy, made challenging her authority seem like attacking the natural order, made her untouchable through mythology and performance and relentless control of her image. That's extraordinary. In a century when women were legally property, when female rulers were considered abominations against nature, when medical textbooks declared women physically and mentally inferior, when the Pope himself declared that women couldn't rule, when half her counsellors believed her womb was wandering around her body, causing madness, Elizabeth took all of that and said, "Watch me." And she did it through propaganda, through performance, through turning her body into a symbol so powerful that questioning it became unthinkable. She weaponized virginity, turned absence into presence, turned what men called weakness into divine strength. But as a long-term strategy, it failed completely. Elizabeth left no heirs. The Tudor dynasty ended with her. All of Henry VIII's efforts, all the wives, all the executions, all the religious upheaval, all to secure the succession. And his daughter ended the line through virginity, through refusal to reproduce. The succession she'd refused to secure led to exactly the crisis she'd feared. Well, not immediately. James's transition was smooth because her counsellors had planned it behind her back. But within decades, England was in chaos. James's son, Charles I, was executed. The monarchy was overthrown. England became a republic briefly, then restored the monarchy, then had another crisis, overthrew James II, invited William and Mary to rule jointly. More upheaval, more bloodshed. All the instability Elizabeth had prevented through sheer force of personality and brilliant propaganda happened anyway, just delayed by 40 years. The cult of the Virgin Queen didn't transfer. James was married, had children, was normal. All the mythology Elizabeth built, the divine favour, the sacred virginity, the special relationship with God, evaporated. England discovered that it didn't actually need a Virgin Queen. It had prospered under Elizabeth, but it could prosper under a married king too. Virginity wasn't necessary, wasn't sacred, was just Elizabeth's particular solution to her particular problem. All of Elizabeth's sacrifices, her personal happiness, her relationships, her chance at family, hadn't created permanent change, just temporary stability. She'd given up everything, and within years of her death, it was like it had never mattered. So what was the point? Maybe the point was Elizabeth herself. Not what she built, but what she proved. She proved that a woman could rule well, could outwit, outlast, and outmaneuver men who thought they were superior, could take a system designed to destroy her and turn it into a weapon, could perform power so convincingly that it became real. She proved that power isn't biological, isn't natural, isn't divinely ordained by gender. Power is performed, earned, maintained through intelligence and strategy and relentless control of narrative. Every female ruler after Elizabeth had her example. Mary II, Anne, Victoria, Elizabeth II. All of them ruling in a world that still didn't really believe women should have power. That still thought women were naturally inferior. That still believed female rulers were anomalies, mistakes, temporary interruptions in the natural order of male monarchy. But they had Elizabeth's precedent, the Virgin Queen, who turned her body into a religion and made it work for 44 years through war and rebellion and assassination attempts and constant pressure to marry. She'd done it, therefore it could be done. Therefore other women could do it too. That's the legacy, not the cult itself, but the proof that the cult could be built, that a woman could take the thing men saw as weakness and transform it into strength. That virginity, that absence, that refusal, that negative space could be filled with meaning so powerful it became sacred. Elizabeth didn't free women, didn't create equality, didn't even particularly help other women. She was brutal to female courtiers who got pregnant out of wedlock, jealous of younger women at court, obsessed with maintaining her own unique status. made it clear that she was the exception, that other women couldn't do what she did, that her power came from being special, chosen, different. Not from women generally being capable of ruling, but she existed, ruled, succeeded, and that mattered, because before Elizabeth, people could say women couldn't rule. After Elizabeth, that argument was demonstrably false. She'd done it for 44 years. Through war and rebellion and religious crisis and assassination attempts, she'd done it without a husband, without male authority, without submitting to anyone. She'd proved it was possible, and she'd done it by weaponizing the exact thing that was supposed to make her weak: her virginity, her unmarried status, her female body. She'd taken what men called vulnerability and made it divine, taken what they called absence and made it presence, taken what they called lack and made it abundance. She'd performed virginity not as purity, but as power, not as protection, but as conquest, not as surrender, but as dominance. That's brilliant, twisted, calculating, effective. Elizabeth I didn't wait for men to give her power. She invented it, built it from symbols and pageants and speeches and portraits, built it from stolen religious imagery and clever rhetoric and absolutely shameless propaganda, turned her body into a sacred object that no man could touch, made herself untouchable because being touched meant losing control. Was it healthy? Absolutely not. Was it sustainable? Obviously not. Did it require immense personal sacrifice? Definitely. She died alone, without love, without family, without anyone who knew her as just Elizabeth instead of as the Virgin Queen. She spent decades performing a role that became a prison, covering herself in poison to maintain an illusion, denying herself every normal human connection to preserve a mythology. She gave up everything that makes life bearable to keep power, and in the end, the power didn't last. The dynasty ended. The cult dissolved. All that remained was the story. But the story matters. The story is everything. Because Elizabeth didn't just survive, she transformed. She took her circumstances, female, illegitimate, unpopular, vulnerable, and turned them into legend. She took virginity, which every other woman of her era experienced as limitation, and made it a weapon. She took marriage, which would have destroyed her power, and made its refusal sacred. She worked for 44 years, against impossible odds, in a world designed to destroy powerful women. Elizabeth turned her virginity into a religion, made England worship at that altar, and died immortal. Not because she had children, because she became a story, the story of the Virgin Queen who refused to be conquered, who ruled alone, who transformed weakness into strength through sheer force of will. That story is still being told. 400 years later, we're still talking about her, still analysing her, still trying to understand how she did it. That's the victory, not political, not biological, narrative. Elizabeth I won the battle for memory, for legacy, for immortality. She wanted a marble stone that declared she'd lived and died a virgin. She got that. And more. She got this. Voices in the dark, hundreds of years later, telling her story, acknowledging her brilliance, recognising that she'd played a game no one thought she could win, and won it anyway. The Virgin Queen is dead. Long live the Virgin Queen. Thanks for staying with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Did Elizabeth's strategy inspire you or disturb you? Was it genius or just a tragic waste? I want to hear your take. And if you're hungry for more stories about women who turned expectations into weapons, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. Sleep well or don't. Sometimes history cuts too deep to let you rest. Sometimes you need to sit with it. Let it wake something up inside you. Elizabeth I turned her body into a religion, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. Good night.